Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to this TDAG seminar. TDAG is a network and a forum that brings together people and organisations to support the role of urban trees through better collaboration in the planning, design, construction, management and maintenance of our urban areas. Evidence-based information is really important to us. Your knowledge is really important to us, and that's why we like to bring everybody here together to facilitate cross-sector working and knowledge exchange. So, as audience members, we really encourage your questions and participation. We would like to thank the Institution of Civil Engineers, the Chartered Institution of Highway Engineers, and the Institute of Chartered Foresters for being our partners today and encouraging everyone to come along. And in a moment, I will hand over to our chair for the day, which is Jim Smith. So Jim C. Smith is the Forestry Commission's Urban Forestry Advisor. He has been a urban forester for more than 35 years, twice the chair of the London Tree Officers Association, and he has been involved in the production of many guidance documents, including the National Joint Utilities Group 10, the LTOA's Risk Limitation Strategy for Tree Root Claims, and both the 2000 and 2023 updates of the Institution of Structural Engineers guidance on subsidence, as well as the current work on technical drawings for street trees, which is the subject of this seminar. So over to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Emma. That's very nice of you to say those kind words. So I'm going to be the chair this afternoon. As Emma said, I'm the Forestry Commission's National Urban Forestry Advisor, so dealing with that. So this is very pertinent. This seminar today is very pertinent in terms of trees in urban areas. And just a sort of as a sort of an introduction, we've got a great selection of speakers. We've got Robert Huxford from the Urban Design Group, Hen Abbott from Gloucestershire City Council, Stephen O'Malley, Founding Director of Civic Engineers, and Esther Colan, Director of the Urban Design Living. So a great selection of speakers who I'm sure you'll be able to pick their brains at the end if you've got any questions. But really, as an introduction, street trees, and trees generally in urban areas, but street trees particularly, seem to be moving up the political and the sort of like the environmental agenda significantly. And TDAG has been all about making sure that they're catered for and looked after. I think there's never been a better policy or a better sort of financial in the context of grants that the Forestry Commission and DEFRA run for putting street trees in the ground. So what I'd like to do is just now introduce our first speaker, who's going to look at that, the challenges for existing trees. So Robert Huxford, who's Director of the Urban Design Group. Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much. If I can share my slides, that's me. So I'm going to be talking about principally the existing streets, but we'll very briefly run over some of the policies, planning policies for new streets as a tiny prelude to what Esther will be discussing a little bit later. So there we go. This is Eddington in Cambridge. Is it a model for a sustainable street? It's got a number of features. You can see trees, they've got room to grow. Waste management is catered for in cassettes, underground cassettes. So that means that bin bags and the footway is kept clear for people to use. There's a district heating system, SUDs are incorporated, and the overall effect is of a high quality environment. This tends to be the exception at the moment. So anyway, let's look at the National Planning Policy Framework. Well, this is one of the starting points for new development. It says that planning policies and decisions should ensure that new streets are tree-lined, and that opportunities are taken to incorporate trees elsewhere in developments, blah, blah, blah. You can read that. And it also qualifies that unless it's specific. Is there a problem?
Oh, it's a...
Hello, is there a problem? No, right.
No, background noise, Robert, continue.
Continue, right. Yes, tree-lined streets, unless in specific cases there are clear, justifiable and compelling reasons why this would be inappropriate. There's the National Model Design Code, and it contains various models for street cross-sections. Trees are covered in the coding process. You can see more detail there. And in the guidelines, there are street tree design principles. So we'll leave the policy behind and go on to existing streets. So a sustainable street retrofit. We're going to face very substantial problems in the future. Heat waves, heat islands, rain bursts, pluvial flooding. There's the existing problem with utilities chaos, and it's something that's going to worsen as we try to work more utilities into that space. Uprated electricity supplies, maybe we'll be moving over to a hydrogen distribution system, district heating and cooling networks, ground source heating, and at surface level, we want to make streets more attractive places for people to enjoy and to use. So sustainable street retrofit, maybe not easy, but maybe, well, let's have a look at this. Balanced decisions, because we're all very siloed these days. What's the proverb? The man with a hammer sees every problem as a nail. If you're a highways maintenance person, naturally, you're going to see the world's problems in terms of highways maintenance. If it's lighting, it's going to be lighting, and you don't want trees getting in the way of your lighting apparatus. Possibly if you're a tree person, you want to plant trees. Well, the thing is that we're all part of the same local authority. It's a question of balancing all these priorities. There are things to balance. There are statutory duties. It's often quoted, the Traffic Management Act, network management duty. This is not a duty that overrules all other duties. There are other duties, public health, duties to children. There's a common law of duty of care. All of these things have to be balanced. Similarly, the central government policies. There's the local authority's own strategy and policies, ranging from planning right through to environment. There's the Equality Act, the public sector equality duty. There's the common law of negligence. And against all of that, there is the reality of the lack of funding for maintenance. Do remember this one. It's the Wensbury unreasonableness principle. It's used as a basis for judicial review, but I think it's always a really good reminder as to the a test for the quality of decisions that ought to be made. The decisions should be reasonable. They should take into account the things that ought to be taken into account, and they shouldn't take into account things that shouldn't be taken into account. It's common sense, really, isn't it? So there we go. You've got the actual judge's ruling there in the court case, and you can look up this one online. So powers, Highways Act 1980, we've got powers to plant trees, no question about that. There's a myth that it's unlawful to plant trees within 15 foot of the centre of the carriageway. Section 141 of the Highways Act gives local authorities, highway authorities, powers to deal with streets, with trees and shrubs and hedges that have been planted within 15 feet of the centre of the carriageway. But it doesn't mean that they're unlawful. And some people get scared by the legislation, and it has to be said that the Highways Act 1980 is not well drafted. There's a lot of repetition, there's a lot of confusion. It doesn't even define highways in a robust sort of way. So it's quite understandable that people pick up the wrong end of the stick. But you can plant trees within 15 feet of the centre of the carriageway. You can plant trees in the carriageway, smack in the middle, and we'll demonstrate that later on. I won't go over that. There's a due to consult before felling street trees. You can, if you're interested in this, have a look at the Highways Act. It's written in English, and if you put a towel on your head, you can understand this stuff. So, street trees, what and where? It varies between no trees to a complete canopy, and on a range of different sorts of land. The tradition is highway maintainable at the public expense, but increasingly we're seeing holes in a highway maintainable at the public expense being held in private ownership of one sort or another, being used for planting street trees so that the highway authority avoids the maintenance burden. There's also the unadopted highway, the private street option, and then there's private land. There's considerable opportunities to plant trees on private land that can then oversail the highway or the street. So you can get some very big trees by using that option. Anyway, so some visual examples ranging from no trees. In medieval streets, there generally aren't trees because the streets would have been full of animals, the animals would have eaten the trees. So the trees in medieval streets tend to be found immediately adjacent to the highway on private land, in a garden or a churchyard, that sort of thing. End of streets, in squares, at junctions, or everywhere. And it can range from no trees to a full canopy. So you feel as though you're going through a forest. Trees can be planted in a footway, in the carriageway, in build-outs, in the central median, in parking strips, in verges. There's endless opportunities to plant trees. Let your imagination run riot and know that the Highways Act 1980 gives powers to plant trees, full stop. And there's potential for huge trees. I thought I'd throw this one in. This is the fabulous largest hedge in the world, running up to about 100 foot, 30 meters. I think it's about a third of a mile long, and Meikler in Perthshire in Scotland. I'm not suggesting that should be an option for a lot of streets, but anyway, it can be done. So let's look at existing streets. There are standard minimum street widths that have persisted for centuries. 1847 Town Improvement Clauses Act. This set the minimum width of a highway as 30 foot. This applies to towns. So we're talking about urban areas, not rural areas. Difficult to get a street tree in these circumstances, but you can put it on private land. The 1875 Public Health Act created the provision of the model bylaws, and this was a sort of building regulations manual for streets of the day. And this set the minimum width of a highway intended as a carriage road as 36 foot between the building lines, 24 foot width for the carriageway, a width that we don't approve of nowadays because it encourages close passing of cyclists when they're being overtaken by car users, and 2 6-foot footways, or footways of at least 6 foot on either side. The London Building Act, 1894, increased the minimum width to 40 foot, and that the 40-foot width got picked up in many other areas as well, going beyond the 36-foot standard required in the model bylaws. So this now is applying to boroughs, urban district councils, cities. So it doesn't apply if the local authority in question was a rural district council. But you have to go back into your local government history to ascertain what was the council in that particular area. This is Blackpool. I think this is a 30-foot street. I forgot to measure it, but you can see there's no trees at all. And well, you may we regard this as being a bit grim now, but when it was built, it would have been a lot better than the conditions that a large majority of the population would have been living in. A street in Crewe. This is a classic bylaw street, 36 foot wide, 6 foot footways, 24 foot carriageway. The reason for 24 foot was so that you could have a vehicle parked on either side of the road with room for a third to go through the middle. And that's what you find in a lot of these streets. Once people start parking in the footway, then everybody tends to do it. And this is a back lane. So also covered by the model bylaws were back lanes not intended for use as a carriage road. This is a rather nice example, I think. Anyway, so you've got, come the turn of the century, about 1900, and this is a drawing that was reproduced from Country Life. They were complaining about the oppressive bylaws and using the example on the left and the example of the right sort of landscape. And they were saying that the example on the right doesn't comply with the bylaws. The only reason why it doesn't comply with the bylaws is that there isn't a footway on both sides. But you've got the general drift. People are getting more and more enthusiastic about trees, landscape feature, greenery, open spaces, clean air, and healthy country living, that sort of stuff. And it's reflected in the various movements that take place, the Town and Country Planning Association. So this is a model village in York, New Earswick, and you can see the sort of landscapes that are and streetscapes that are being delivered. Lot lower density, plenty of trees and grass verges. So into the 20th century, we've got streets being designed with trees incorporated right from the outset. So the problems are going to be very much with 19th century streets and prior, in terms of introducing new trees. So challenges, damage to footways, I'll come in just a moment, but some people say, trees, you don't want to plant trees because they're a hazard to drivers. There's currently a movement to adopt a systems approach to roadside safety. Passive safety, it's called, crash-friendly roadside environments. Frangible posts and columns are being introduced, and there's the case of Mark Boland, rock musician, who died by when the car in which he was being driven left the road and hit a tree, although apparently death was due to hitting a post rather than the tree. Well, yes, nobody wants anybody to be injured or killed on the road. The thing is, when you get to an urban area, it's not just trees, and you don't want to go crash into a tree. The car is not going to come off well. But there are going to be vulnerable road users occupying the same environment, and cars and vehicles should not be leaving the road at all. Just as much as a car could hit a tree, it could hit a pedestrian, it could hit a cyclist, and cyclists and pedestrians are not crash friendly. Footway defects, well, the main issue there is utilities opening and the overrunning of footways by vehicles. The repeated opening of highways breaks the surface. The remediation is very rarely conducted in a robust way. Compaction doesn't occur, so the surface will subside and it will produce a trip hazard. So, it is possible for street trees to lift paving slabs, but it's something that can be dealt with by maintenance. It's hugely important, and we're back to this balanced decision making. Trees can produce problems, but problems do have solutions. And if it's a toss-up between no trees and trees with occasional problems that can be addressed by maintenance, let's go for trees and maintenance. We got the Equality Act, that's worth noting, and the obstruction of the footway. So there you've got a salt bin. People may say we need an 1800 millimeter wide footway or 2000 millimeters. Well, things sometimes have to be put in there. Sometimes they're discarded. You've got the central photograph where a highways contractor has blocked access to the buttons on the traffic signal. These are they material obstructions or hindrances or inconveniences? So just as much as a tree planted in a footway, one could say it's obstructing the highway, but is it a material obstruction? Is it actually stopping people from getting past? And in the vast majority of instances, it won't be stopping people getting past. It will be a temporary hindrance in the way, but people can get past it. Trees go missing and aren't replaced. This is an example from Upton. You'll see on the left, there were 3 trees, and in 2022, there's just 2. So there's the provision of funds for replacement that needs to be considered. Utilities versus trees. This is a really desperate issue. I think the trees on the right, that's a huge London plane. That was part of an excavation in Cambridge Circus, and it's amazing how that tree survives. And on the left, in the embankment in London, you've got utilities that are actually running under the tree. But utilities are problems within themselves. They're in conflict with each other. often utilities openings to repair utilities will damage other utilities, and there's this perpetual cycle. Most urban streets are absolutely crammed full of pipes, cables, conduits, and well, there's been guidance, but is it fit for modern purposes? On the left, 1946, you've got a cross-section of a footway. It refers to a 10-foot footpath. Well, I don't think there are an awful lot of 10-foot footpaths or footways, so a bit of magical thinking there. That's why that hat's there, by the way. And on the right-hand side, the present-day National Joint Utilities Group or Streetworks guidance. As you can see, there's just a direct evolutionary path. Say probably for over 100 years, been doing basically the same sort of thing, although the amount and sophistication of utilities has increased quite dramatically. Also, over 100 years, there was a bloke called Eugene Enard, who gave a paper at the Royal Institute of British Architects Town Planning Conference on refutur, and he advocated this fully designed approach to incorporating utilities and services. And maybe if we're going to sweat our streets, and if we're going to encourage compact city living and well, environments that can deal with all that climate change can and will throw at us, then maybe we need to be thinking something along these lines. There are combined utilities ducts and tunnels. In some cities you can find these, more on the continent than in the UK, because perhaps we're a bit backward when it comes to these things, shockingly. There's the National Underground Asset Register that is being brought through. So the notion is that I think within a couple of years, this will be available, and all underground assets will have been properly mapped. And the detail provided by the mapping will increase progressively over time. The University of Birmingham has been doing a tremendous amount of research on multiple utility ducts and tunnels. And the thing is, once we can get the utilities ordered, it's a place for everything and everything in its place, then space will be yielded to do other things. And maybe, just as we've got a national model design code, we need a national underground design code that covers all of the things that we will be increasingly needing to be placing under the surfaces of streets, ranging from drainage through to energy, sewerage, communications, and of course, tree roots. So lastly, finance and trees. What has happened to the local authority budget and the highways budget? Well, Barnet Council in about 2010 produced something called the Barnet Graph of Doom, and they projected some of the key demands on the local authority's budget against projected funding. And this is in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis and a period of austerity. So that's what they predicted. What actually happened? Well, it wasn't quite as bad as that, but the demand for the expenditure on children's social care has gone up significantly. And maybe local authorities, well, they are constantly being criticised for in the press by for the quality of care provided. It's pretty grim time to be in a local authority. And what happened on the funding side? Well, Barnet, their core spending power was down by 10%, and the settlement funding, this is the money given to local authorities by central government, down by 72.9%. That's a huge change. The highways budget for Barnet over that same period declined and has been unstable, and it must be hellishly difficult to operate under those circumstances. There was a boost in budgets over the COVID period, so I guess it'll be a few years yet before we establish how much damage is being done by the reduction in funding. And of course, street trees, they're funded by and through the highways side of things. If you look at the budgets for England as a whole, so figures on the are in terms of millions. So the highways budget England-wide started off by being about 6.7 billion in, and this is in constant prices adjusted for inflation, declined progressively, and by, well, currently for this last financial year, it was back to 6.6 billion. But if you add up all the cumulative cutbacks, it's massive. So over 16 billion pounds is the deficiency in funding. And, you know, we've had the same highways. So things have been really uncomfortable, and you can understand highways, local authority highways department going through a lot of grief over that period. And what are the consequences of scarce funding? Well, funding starts to be the overweening design imperative. For highways maintainable at the public expense, we're getting utilitarian streets, poor quality, cheap material specification, or a requirement for maintenance specifications, design specifications that will require virtually no maintenance. You've got highway authorities requiring huge commuted sums, maybe as much as £2,000 or £3,000 per tree. And in some instances, highway authorities not wanting to adopt streets at all. We've had this issue, I raised the issue about holy streets before, where sections of the street are left in private ownership, be it a grass verge, be it a tree pit. And this creates a really messy sort of situation. And surely it doesn't make an awful lot of common sense somehow to divide responsibility.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up very shortly.
I'll be wrapping up, but this is the last.
Can you see my camera? I've switched my camera on. Can you see me?
No, I can't. Sorry.
Oh, okay, right.
And private streets, well, that's the last option. There's a possibility of higher specs, but it comes with, in effect, creating another tier of local government. Perhaps I should shut up at that point. This is the last slide, so I'll stop the share.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Robert. Some really fascinating information in that presentation. And what I'll be doing is just doing a recap of each speaker's presentation, pulling out some salient points at the end of everyone's talks. And then that will give us the basis for the general discussion and questions afterwards. So thank you very much for that, Robert. That was fascinating. So now I'm going to pass straight over to Hen Abbott, who's from Gloucestershire City Council, and she's going to be talking to us about why highway engineers would welcome technical planting guidance. So Hen, over to you.
Hello, I'm going to try and share my screen. Hope this works. Right, so I need to minimize that.
Yeah, that's
fine. Is
fine.
that okay? Can everyone? Right. We're halfway there. You've got one slide. Hopefully you'll see the rest as well. I'm going to be very, very quick. You'll be pleased to know. And so I am Hen Abbott. I'm a principal development engineer working with highways development management. So that's working with new adoptions and 278 schemes, new works to the highway. I work for Gloucestershire Council. We're a shire authority, which is predominantly rural. And I think something that may come at the end of this presentation, you may find that there's quite a split between the predominantly urban unitary authorities and the shire authorities that are predominantly rural. Right, can we move on? Bear with me. I thought this was going to be difficult.
Yes, thanks yourself.
We're not moving. We're not moving.
Are you using your laptop for that or your mouse?
There we go.
Yeah.
I'm using I've got a difficult. Okay, so part of our job is to create attractive, long-lasting built environment, and we want street trees to thrive. We really do. We're not the enemy here. We really do want this to work. But some of the existing problems, we have a legacy where we have a lot of street trees that have been poorly planted. They're damaging the urban realm. Root heave of footways is the biggest problem, by far the biggest problem. It's not just unsightly and causes maintenance issues. It causes real safety issues, and the safety issues it causes are to the most vulnerable users. So people with sensory impairment, people with restricted mobility, the people that we really need to be protecting. Another big problem is blocking the drainage. Tree roots seek water, of course they do. And leaf fall as well, as you can see on the image on the left, they can block gullies. So they can block gullies in two ways. They can block gullies in the way that you can see, but also that leaf litter gets flushed through the system, and that can also block the drainage system, leading to problems further down. So most problems are caused by the wrong tree selection, wrong location, and wrong planting method. Wrong tree, wrong place, quite simply. In the image on the left, you can, if you look very, very carefully, see a street light hidden in there, which is pointless. And we know that the street light is difficult to maintain, that the infrastructure of the street light and the tree are competing with each other. You're going to have dark spots. Street lights are put in the places they're put in for the very good reason that that's where they're needed. So you're going to create safety issues by dark spots with having trees. That could be a sign. You can have trees overgrowing signs. And the result of all this, unfortunately, it's the tree dies or the highway infrastructure is damaged, quite often both. And this leads to poor use of the highway maintenance budget. Robert mentioned quite a lot of highways maintenance budget. We have a very, very small budget. It is shrinking. We have to use it very, very wisely. And quite often the tree will just be cut down. It won't be replaced. We don't have the budget to do that. This lovely built environment with trees that we want to create, we're just kind of making it worse by having trees inappropriately growing that we're then later cutting down. Okay, so how do we plant a tree? Well, this is what most people think of when you talk about planting a tree. Maybe not the king, or maybe you do, I don't know. But you dig a hole, you shove a tree in. What's so difficult? That's great if you've got a big open field, if you've got an arboretum, if you've got public open space, absolutely perfect. But where you've got a very small verge with a footway, carriageway either side, or perhaps you're just completely surrounded by hard surfacing, you've got a footway in public realm, right in the street, what do you use? Well, there is a bewildering choice of planting solutions. This is just a very small section that took me a few minutes to pull off the internet. They work, maybe they don't. But thinking about this, this is quite an interesting little couple of schemes. The same system, different results. So just choosing the right system of choosing the right crate or tree pit design or whatever, it isn't that simple, because both these schemes on the left and the right were carried out within the same year, I believe. There are a few streets, literally a few streets from each other. They're in the same town. They're both installed with the same system. The one on the left was installed with the manufacturer's direct guidance. So it was a scheme that was partnered with the system manufacturer. The one on the right was an off-the-shelf. The contractor chose the system, bought it off the shelf, installed it themselves. And you can see a massive difference. And the photographs were taken actually within a few minutes of each other. So they are very much like for like. And this leads to another problem, the design of it. So we as engineers, we need to select the right design. This is just a very small selection of some of the drawings that I get presented with for highway adoption checks. I don't know. And there is guidance. There is some guidance out there. There is some very good guidance out there. But what it doesn't do is give us the very detailed planting advice. A lot of this guidance, you will find words like, you must consider and think about this and take this into consideration. It doesn't give you the exact detail like I had on the previous page, what we need, exactly what we need to know. So just to kind of bring this back to what I was asked to talk about, what we need the guidance to help us with. So we want to deliver thriving trees, and we really do. We don't want to cut them down. We want them to be an asset, not a burden, not a maintenance burden. We don't want them to be a burden to current or future generations. But to do this, we need to know the right species for the location. We need to know the right planting method for that tree. So choose the right tree, put it in the right place, and put it in the right way. We need to know the correct construction method for the tree planting. We need to know the right growing medium. We need to know how to correctly check it. So when we're given these different drawings by developers and their contractors, we need to know what's right and what's wrong. We need to know how to advise them to get it right. We need to know how to inspect it when they're planting the tree, putting the construction in. And after it's all planted nicely, right tree, right location, right way of planting it, we then need to know how to maintain it properly. We need the correct short and long-term maintenance regime for that tree. So the benefits of good technical planting guidance, it's going to be the best thing for the tree. So the tree is going to be given the best opportunity it can to thrive. It's going to be consistent and replicable. It's going to be based on expert advice. It's not going to be someone's idea. We're going to get advice from the best people to give us the best chance for us to get it right. It's going to be easy for construction. We're not going to be wandering around on site scratching our heads. We're going to know how to construct it. It's going to be constructed easy. The contractors are going to be able to get it right each time. We're going to have confidence in the designs that we're checking. The guidance has got to be easy to follow. A lot of different people have got to be able to follow this guidance that are not going to be experts in trees, in biology, in arboriculture, or in soil. And most importantly, it's got to be national guidance. So all authorities are going to be basing their tree planting on the same national guidance. And I told you I was going to be quick. This is my last slide. So to bring it right round to the question, why do highway engineers welcome technical planting guidance? Very, very simply, so we can stop delivering the left image and start delivering the right image. So thank you very much for listening. I've now got to stop sharing. Okay, there we go.
That's great. Thank you very much, Helen. Really informative and
very quick.
and quick as well, which we sometimes we like, sometimes we could. But I'm sure you'll be getting some questions at the end, so stand by for those. So thank you very much for that. Now we're going to move on. We've got a bit of time in hand, so we'll add that to the discussion time at the end of the session. Now we're going to hear from Stephen O'Malley, who's a founding director of Civic Engineers, and he's going to talk to us about understanding the process to get the specifications and the contract.
Jim, can I just interrupt you? Chris has very kindly stepped in for Stephen, who was unavoidable, having had to go over to Ireland or something at short notice.
Okay, so Chris Kendrick, then we're going to.
Hi, Jim.
You,
yeah, sorry to disappoint everyone. It's not Stephen, unfortunately, but I will do my best to sort of do this section
okay,
justice.
Well, take it away. You've got 20 minutes. Okay, if you need a little bit more, thanks to Hen, you can have it. So.
I will. Yeah, should be about right. I won't try and keep everyone too long. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now.
Yes, looks good.
Is that okay? Full screen?
Yep.
Fab. So delivering trees in streets, I think everyone knows what the kind of the focus of today's session is all about. I think really what this presentation's focusing on is what's the process to sort of develop the design and understand what the right specification and ultimately being able to install what has been designed. Let me just forward on there. Sorry, just go back a slide. This is just a sort of quick overview, like we do like to sort of include in lots of our presentations, but it just shows the kind of the point sort of overlap between the kind of urban environment and a rural environment, and where really we kind of, you know, we want to sort of get to, especially with the kind of incorporation of trees and planting and sustainable drainage within urban spaces. Trees are kind of fundamental to that kind of overlap. These are some of the kind of documents that we've been involved in from Civic Engineers, so some of our kind of experience and contributions to relevant guidance, SUDS guidance in London, Leeds, our spaces, and they all include sort of planting and requirements for implementation of trees. I don't think anyone's questioning that. You know, it is good for kind of streetscapes and public realm areas, and you know, obviously the crux of it is really just how it's delivered. So some of the key design considerations, there's probably many more, and this is probably too many to sort of run through sort of in one slide, but you kind of just get a picture of what all the considerations need to be from a design perspective. I think every design sort of starts from a vision. You know, there needs to be a vision for that particular street, that particular public space, and then really kind of working around the clock from that is all the kind of different factors that kind of play into that. I think one of the big ones which has been touched on already. Robert sort of went into quite a bit of detail on this, and there may be some overlap with some of the slides that are due to come from me, but just what's in the ground, in-ground obstructions, that, you know, predominantly that's utilities, but it can be other obstructions as well, and I'll show a few examples on what that might be. The design and application. So a key document really, which was probably a breath of fresh air from the sort of standard design manual for roads and bridges approach, and again, which, you know, guidance which focuses on creating spaces for multiple users of that space rather than just being sort of car dominated spaces. And in that, I think it's good to understand what space and what street you actually have. If it's quite a high movement status, as in your motorways and your kind of dual carriageways and A roads, then it's quite difficult. They're not really a kind of there's not a place focus there. So really the kind of type of street, the type of road does determine where the kind of amount of planting and street trees kind of sits within that. So I think it's also good to kind of understand that very early on. You know, what road are you actually looking at? Is it a retrofit? Is it a new road? Is it a new kind of residential street? And that kind of really dictates the sort of level and the kind of detail around that planting eventually. Again, just some of the kind of key design considerations. I think what I wanted to sort of get across in this one is that there are some kind of opportunities with, especially with vehicles, pedestrian, cycling, in terms of how space is linked to the kind of the wider areas, and obviously the kind of street planting and street trees needs to be considerate of, you know, what's in the kind of wider area as well, rather than just focusing on that street. It's really kind of that design consideration to tie it in with the kind of wider area. You'll have seen part of this slide before, but it's probably not a surprise. The kind of utopian utility, or maybe not in utopian actually, but the kind of standard utility installation on the left-hand side is obviously taken from NJUG guidance, and then the reality on the right-hand side. That was actually there was proposed to be it was actually for a manhole chamber in that location, and the utilities were shown in a different place based on GPR records. So we had to relocate that and sort of design on the spot. But until the services are uncovered in the ground, I think what this gets across is you can't really kind of predict what is in the ground. Even, you know, sometimes even with numerous GPR surveys, the sort of trial pits that kind of, you know, need to follow on from the back of that. You can't trial pit a whole kind of length of footway, for example. So you know, there's still an unknown until the eventual excavations are undertaken. This again just shows you the kind of the type of information, and really it's quite important, obviously, to get hold of all existing utility information, stats plans, undertake GPR surveys, pinpoint sort of key locations for where additional intrusive investigation needs to be undertaken. So this particular example is in Manchester. It's known as the Medieval Quarter near the cathedral. There was actually not just the kind of utility considerations here, but there was a series of catacombs beneath the adopted highway and the public realm space. You may have seen this sort of scheme. It was the Glade of Light memorial to the the Manchester bomb victims, and it was good to kind of obtain not just kind of stats plans and records, but obviously historic records as well from local businesses, and this also applies to public realm spaces where I've had personal experience where there's buildings with basements, or shops with basements, and it's not obvious from a topo survey or even a kind of GPR survey that there are light wells that project out into the footway, and they've just kind of been capped over in certain points. So all the information you can get really to sort of give you as much information in terms of what might be in the ground, so you can start to map out and inform the design really and the layout. This is an example of a project, this is a sort of based on a survey, a GPR survey from a project in Preston. What we started to do was to use that information and start to layer up where we could potentially install trees within that space. You can actually see there are sort of quite clear zones between some of the utilities that were picked up from the GPR survey. So we really kind of targeted those as where we could position trees, and there was obviously a coordination exercise between us as engineers and the landscape architect, and obviously looking at what shops front onto those spaces, because there needs to be consideration of where those trees sit. You can't just because there's a clear space in the ground, it has to be considerate of where it is in relation to a shop frontage. Sorry. GPR survey, I just saw that question flash up. It's a ground penetrating radar survey. I know there's a kind of a vast array of audience members today, but basically what that does is scans the surface of the ground and picks up anomalies within the ground, mainly metallic objects, so cables and gas mains, so cast iron gas mains will be picked up quite clearly. Plastic doesn't get picked up by the kind of magnetic detection, so that's when trial pits or excavations to expose the surfaces. Obviously, once we've kind of worked out the layout and where trees could sit within the kind of public space or highway, really it comes down to the detail and just considerations of what trees need. I know it was touched on within the last slide from Hen about the various options there are for especially tree planting within hard landscaped areas. The sort of cellular type systems, structural soils, and I think these are some of the examples as well, and some of the kind of real life examples. I think from my experience, the best approach is to try and locate trees within soft landscaping. So if you can introduce a stretch of planting or soft landscaping, then planting trees within those zones are a lot easier to achieve and probably less costly from an installation perspective. The top left image is actually a sort of, I think that's a green blue urban system, which, as you can see, is quite a large footprint, and really that's to kind of generate, I think actually 2 trees sat within that particular pit, but it was to sort of generate the volume needed, the soil volume needed within that pit. Those tree pits actually function as a sustainable drainage feature as well, so that the surfacing around the top of the tree pit allows for water to kind of permeate through and utilize the storage within the cells as well. The bottom image is actually a rain garden, so that functions as, you can sort of see the curbs which are sort of stepped to allow surface water runoff from the carriageway to enter the tree pits, or the rain gardens, and then there was also a kind of opportunity to install trees in those locations. On that particular scheme, we were blessed in the fact that it was an existing 2-way street, and we took that down to a kind of a one-way street, and this was part of a wider town centre kind of regeneration really, and redistributing traffic around the town centre. So what that meant was we bought back part of the existing carriageway, which was relatively clear of services, in order to install trees and sustainable drainage. This sort of leads on to sort of developing the details for the tree pits really, and there's absolutely loads of variations for this, and you know, I think with the best will in the world, the kind of standard details for this type of tree pit arrangement, unless you can really sort of nail down what is in the ground, and a lot of that does unfortunately tend to come once work starts on site. But you know, I think as much survey information as you can sort of gather beforehand, the better, in order to kind of set out this. And I think this is the type of detail that would apply to a new street, for example, a residential development, where there's a clear service zone and there's a clear sort of planting zone where streets can be located. And I think it goes back to the kind of the sort of carriageway and the highway widths and the kind of the typologies in terms of that street cross section. Just some of completed schemes, not all Civic Engineer completed schemes, but this is the project I mentioned earlier. So this was Medieval Quarter. You can sort of see the top left image was a sort of very early image when it was a typical sort of carriageway. And that this sort of leads on to Deansgate in the centre of Manchester. And then there was an interim period where the road was closed to vehicles, and there was various sort of planters installed as a kind of just sat on the surface of the existing carriageway. That was probably several years that kind of interim approach was in place. And then eventually the kind of scheme, the larger image, is that taken from that same position really, which just created that public realm space with a collection of new trees within a kind of central, what was a kind of grassed area, a fairly bare, sort of sparse grassed area. Again, quite lucky on that scheme to be blessed with so much space. It's not always the case. This is Altrincham town centre. Top left, I'm actually not sure what date that is, but you can sort of see the evolution from sort of trams running down the centre of the street, and just how that kind of focus shift to a more kind of vehicle dominated environment. There's still the same amount of traffic, and this is a kind of more recent one. Apologies, it was taken when the tree was looking a bit sorry for itself, but the you know, the opportunity to kind of introduce street trees here was sort of seen as quite key. Within this scheme as well, we'd managed to sort of reduce the carriageway width and push the trees out to within the sort of more of a clear zone towards the edge of the original carriageway. So again, it's like kind of those considerations really, just trying to kind of, you know, if you can and there's enough sort of carriageway width to start with, try and buy some of that back to sort of make use of some of that clear space within the ground. Some more examples of Altrincham. I won't dwell on that too much. This was actually not a Civic Engineer scheme, but I thought it was quite an interesting one. Residential street, Van Gogh Walk in London, and just how a space could be completely transformed. Actually, some of the existing trees on the left hand side were retained in situ, and you know, with all the kind of additional trees as well, just makes for such a transformational space, and you know, more of a kind of pedestrian focused space. This is a current scheme, another one in Manchester. Sorry about that, but it is Stretford in Manchester. What's going on then? It's actually phase one is complete on this scheme at the moment, but we've taken a sort of dual carriageway and transformed that into just a single carriageway. And again, very blessed with space on this one, but all the trees are planted within soft landscaping. you can see the sort of gravel to the top of there. This will establish a lot more. This was probably taken maybe a month ago. So we and only sort of planted maybe a month or so before that. So there's a lot more establishment to come. But just shows you what you can sort of achieve if you could, I suppose if you do have that space. Any questions? This is an image of Mayfield Park, but I'll hand back over there, Jim.
That's great. Thanks very much, Chris. That's brilliant. What we'll do is we'll have questions at the end. So I'm going to summarise everyone's talk, and then people can ask questions if that's okay. So what we'll do is, thanks for that, Chris. Some really great examples that you've given there. Again, food for thought for people to kick off when we're going into the discussion on how you actually achieve that at scale across the country, really, because some of the examples you've given there are particularly good, but they're they're with schemes that you've worked on as a company, haven't you? So it's been really important that those sorts of that sort of knowledge is rolled out across the country. So absolutely for that. So now we're going to go to Esther Kurland, who's Director of Urban Design Learning, and she's going to talk to us about the benefits of authority-wide urban design code, which is really topical at the moment. So Esther, over to you.
Hello, hello everybody. Yeah, I'm Esther Kurland from Urban Design Learning. We provide training and support for local authorities around the country, but I'm also involved with the Office of Place on the interim board there. And the Office of Place is a new government, arm's length government body, which is promoting good design through the planning system mainly, but also very interested in streets and in trees and greening. And I'm going to talk about a new requirement in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, which is potentially changing significantly the way planning works. That's what I've been asked to talk about. I would just say I've got a really horrible cough at the moment, so I don't know how well I'm going to do, and apologies because I'm going to cough through this talk, I'm afraid. So hopefully you can see the screen fine. So the National Model Design Code that Robert actually just mentioned right at the beginning of the session has a theory or a concept within it. It isn't actually a code itself, although it can be used for that. It's more a methodology for local authorities to produce codes. And the idea is you look at your place, your area, it's authority-wide, or it's a particular town centre or a particular site, and you analyse it and you work out what you want to achieve from it, and you provide clear, definitive, measurable codes which can be used to support and to direct the design. The concept is that this will add certainty. It makes the decision making, it pulls it up front in the planning system, and it involves local people so that they can say what they want and what they find agreeable and acceptable in terms of change in their area. So that's the concept in the National Model Design Code. And then we've got the National Planning Policy Framework. So I'm going to focus on planning here as opposed to highway requirements, which says quite a few different things, but basically it's saying these codes and design guides as well, and master plans or spatial plans, which is how these requirements, which are non-spatial, sort of land spatially in a place so where they fit. So when we're talking about street trees, the code or the guide can say what sort of street tree, what type of pit, and how many, and the master plan or a town plan or in some sort of spatial plan will explain where that relates to. And local authorities can, as far as the NPPF is concerned, they can do this at different spatial scales for their whole authority-wide area for a neighbourhood of particular sites. But the LUHC itself, which is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, is a little bit more, it's a bit confusing because the wording kind of changes and we're all sort of batting around just trying to work out what it all means. But basically the act itself, because the NPPF can keep changing and it will change in probably not too distant future, the act says you have to, local authorities, you have to set out your design requirements for the whole of your area. Although those do not have to cover every aspect of design, every part of the area for every type of design issue or every type of development. So it's kind of pick and mix, because you couldn't write a code for a local authority that covered all types of development, all design elements of those developments for everywhere. The idea is that you really understand the priorities for different parts of your local authority through doing that upfront analysis. So you're identifying the problems, which could be a lack of street trees, for example. You do a character appraisal that explains where you've got more street trees, where you haven't got the street trees, where you need the street trees because the streets there are overheating in terms of the environment for using the street as a place, but also the buildings around them are getting too hot, or because you actually want to clean the air there, or you want to change the image or the character of the area to support new development or improve regeneration, etc. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And you talk to people, engagement about the people who are using that area. What is it that you think is important? Some lessons there probably from that Sheffield example, although they're doing some fantastic SUDs now. Then you kind of work out your coding plan. So you might say, right, these types of residential areas, Metroland, for example, taking the example of street trees, we are going to look for this type of tree, put in this way, in this part. You know, it could be building out you allow space for 4 on-street car parking spaces, then you take out a car parking space and you put in the what's now the carriageway, so not in the pavement where there's more likely to be utilities. You put in a tree and maybe a swing or a bench and some SUDs, and you do that all the way down. So that's the sort of thing you say, well, we'll do that in this area, but this town centre we'll have the town centres will have a different approach. And then you write those up. I'm making it sound very simple. It's not that simple. Now, there have been about 25 examples or pathfinders, pilots and pathfinders that the government has been funding over the last few years of taking forward the idea of design coding in the planning system. And I'm going to show you just 3 because I haven't got much time and also haven't got much voice. 3 examples taken from them. But if you want to look at more, if you go to the urbandesignlearning.com website, we've got a library of them. All the ones that have been published in the last couple of years are all on our website, links to them, so you can go and have a look at more if you want. But I'm just showing them what they look like. So this looks like it's from the National Model Design Code, but it's not. It's actually from a Medway design code, and they will talk about forms. So they'll start to say, well, we want blocks, so that top image on the left hand side of the page is of an urban block, and we want these perimeter blocks where all the gardens face each other and all the fronts of the houses and the buildings face out onto the street. It's quite a good way of designing an area, and this is the width we want from them, and this is the kind of building line. That bottom picture is on both sides, is sort of showing how that there's a strong interface between the outdoor spaces and the buildings themselves, and how that works. And then they may talk about types of windows, etc. So that's the sort of thing in codes about buildings. And then sometimes they will be much more focused, you know, by looking at what their priorities are and their issues on solar orientation in this case. So this particular code is saying, okay, we're going to say how much fenestration we want in different elevations to make sure that our homes that are getting built are not going to either be too expensive to heat because they're not getting any solar gain, but also aren't going to overheat. So that's a different sort of example. And then this one, which is from the North Circular Road in London, actually, it's looking at a retail park, an industrial estate next to the North Circular. And it's trying to make it in its coding to change that area over time to a mixed use area by bringing residential in, but significantly changing some of the very harsh urban realm and street conditions there. And you can see different colours in this on this one, because there is an issue that some codes can be very directive. So they say you must do this, and it's really clear whether a scheme coming forward has met that or not. Sometimes it's what they should do or what they could do, and the colour is getting lighter, going from must to should, could in this particular example. And you can see they're splitting up the road. This is an existing road, so this is about changing the North Circular condition. So the actual width is set for most parts of it, although where it changes a little bit, they're saying, well, if you've got a building, you're developing this site, you might have to move your building back a bit because we want this maximum width in there. And then they talk about nature. A lot of them, I'm so sorry, talk about nature and where the trees should go and what should be happening in the public realm. So all of those codes, and in fact many of the examples you can see on our website, and Office of Place has also got a website with some examples, but they've got less in there at the moment because they're kind of going through a system of checking the quality of them, whereas the Urban Design Learning website is just putting anything up there for interest. We're not saying whether they're good or not, but all of them probably say something about streets, and I reckon most of them will say something about planting on the streets. Maybe they don't all say what the street trees, the coding for the street trees themselves should be, because they haven't identified it as a priority, or they don't know what to say. And this is why I think what TDAG is doing in producing some actual code material is really, really important, some details, some technical drawings, because the local authorities can pick them up and put them into their local authority-wide or area design codes without having to reinvent the wheel or reinvent the tree pit. And there's two types of development in the planning system which would relate to street trees. I recently was lucky enough to go on the Housing Design Awards site visits. We looked at all the shortlisted housing schemes that are the best in the last year. And these three examples, I took pictures which showed these are all new buildings, and they've been put in next to existing street trees. So when you're told you can't keep the trees, you can. You just have to, the local authority has to require and explain how to keep the trees, and the buildings have to be built accordingly. The one on the left with a sort of curvy shell-like frontage is actually built off-site and craned in. So there was very little issue with the trees there. The other two are a little bit more difficult, but it certainly can do. So certainly when we're looking at existing street trees and existing streets, codes can say how infill should relate to them, and policy can as well. And then of course there's new streets. We've already seen a picture of Eddington, the bigger picture here from Robert earlier. Cambridge is had a lot of growth recently. It's all design coded, so there's very clear, consistent requirements, particularly for streets and cycle routes and how the junctions work. You see that tight radii in the junction there. It's not a big splay. How you've got a swale there. You've got trees on the edges of the swale. The swale's going to hold water back when it rains a lot, so it doesn't all flood down to the pinch point in the drainage system, etc. And the coding for the buildings as well. But you can see the result of the good coding in Cambridge uses for streets. The other two examples are interesting too. The middle one is in Basildon in Essex, and it was all of the houses were actually built in a factory, and they were all very coded, so they all got very similar elements which were constructed off-site, and then the owners bought them sort of 4 months before they were finished and could decide what sort of frontage they wanted, what colours, what materials, and some of the internal layouts. All the homes there were under 400,000 at the time to help with the new home bonus, but the requirements and the code for the area included the street trees as well. And the last one is a very low density rural scheme in Surrey, where trees are really seen as a vital part of creating the character. And then Surrey County Council have produced a street with Create Streets Help, have produced a street design guide for the whole county, which is allowing them to both Surrey County Council, but also the district councils, to be able to say yes to some more innovative and more tree friendly street designs, rather than there's some things in the chat, where DM design manual for roads and bridges is applied rigorously to every sort of street, including these, and you just wouldn't get anything like these if you applied that guidance. It's meant to keep people safe on motorways, not in residential streets. But you can see in the middle picture I mentioned in the chat, or I mentioned earlier, sort of the idea that you put trees in where the parking is, so you don't have when you've got the design code for the streets, you often just get a cross section, but actually what you want is a transcript as well. So in this case, it's saying, okay, we'll have space for 2 car parking spaces, and then we'll have a build out which has got the street tree in it, so it's not sitting in the pavement. That allows a much more efficient use of space. It's a good way of the parking working, because you're using the street to navigate in and out of the parking space, so you don't have to have extra space for that, but you're getting the street trees in there in a protected and an appropriate way without affecting, if this doesn't have a cycle lane, but if it did, it would be on the other side of the tree. Just a very quick notice of what's the difference between design guidance and design codes, and I did mention it before, but it's probably useful. So your design guidance on street trees may start to talk about, we want some street trees, wouldn't that be nice? And we're going to look for schemes to show us that in their design and access statements, but the code is going to say you must have a street tree every 20 meters, and it's got to be this big when you put it in, and it's got to be this type of species, and it's got to be that type of planting arrangement. Now you might feel that that's not possible, but if you can get that approved and agreed, especially with your highway authority, if you're not a unitary authority, the area that you're working in is not a unitary authority, so you can get that all of those details agreed once in your code. That's going to be much easier than trying to get them argue it out for every single scheme, and the developers then know what they have to do, and that's what they always say they want to do. They want to know, otherwise they're in a painful area. And I sorry, this is not a very good tree, but those directive codes, like what I've just explained for the street trees, would be the fruit on the top of a tree, but they have to be derived from the DNA of your local plan policies and national policies and your regulations. Things like now biodiversity net gain requirements as well are going to be influencing this, and then you can branch out in terms of your requirements for a local authority wide area into the branches being for specific types of street or types of area or types of development. And some of that will be guidance, as you saw in that example with the different colours, where some are must, some are should, some are coulds. Some of it's going to be guidance, but the directive codes at the top are the most useful ones to actually apply, because there's much less concern or potential for disagreement or different interpretations of them. So an authority-wide design code, which is the thing that the LUHC is asking local authorities to do, and they are really starting to think about it now. It's got to be part of their new style local plan. It can focus down on key development issues, so you can find out if your authority where you work is doing one of these, and is it looking at street trees or not as part of it. It can set clear and ambiguous directive requirements, and it can influence site capacities. I'm not going to go into that here because it's probably not relevant for street trees. They are about stopping the worst design, probably. They can lead to very good schemes, like in Cambridge, but the architects amongst us on the call, or I'm not an architect, I'm a planner, but architects will say, well, you need to leave some flexibility within the code for us to be creative, and otherwise everything's going to end up looking exactly the same. So they won't actually replace architectural creativity on a site-by-site basis, although they can include that within the way that they're drawn up. They're not going to cover everything everywhere, and they're not going to necessarily create award-winning schemes. They might do, but they might help an award-winning scheme to be created, because they've taken away the risk on a lot of the decisions, and the architect and the client can really focus on the things that they can make it very special. And yeah, that's the website if you want to look at those examples. Thank you.
That's marvellous. Thank you very much for that. That's a really fascinating look into how design codes. I've certainly learned the difference between design guidance and design codes. So thank you very much for that. That's been really helpful. What I'm going to do now is just to summarise our speakers. Some key points from some of our speakers, then we'll open it up to a question and answer session. We've got some 45 minutes scheduled time, so we should have a good question and answer session if you've got any burning questions for any of the speakers, and followed by a general discussion. But what I'm going to do now is just quickly summarize each of our speakers' content in turn. So Robert was looking at making sure that we had balanced decisions, and I liked his word monomania. I think he meant, Robert, I think you meant silo working there, didn't you? Something like that in terms of one issue sort of stuff going forward. And then obviously misinterpretation of the Highways Act, confusion about that. And then the importance of street widths in getting making sure that we can actually do what we want to do. And then the old chestnut of utilities, what others, and that was mentioned by Chris as well and others. Enjoyed the graph of doom. I'm sure I don't know if there's anyone from Barnet on the call, but I think it's better now than it was previously, as I understand it, in Barnet. So there we go. So Hen's talk was looking really at the damage that trees can cause to footways and also underground stuff like block drains, and then conflicts with lighting, the issues that conflicts with all the things that highway engineers have to deliver as part of their day job, where trees may actually cause issues with, and also looking at hard landscaping planting and the infrastructure required to achieve that. So we looked at some similar stuff that Chris mentioned about underground structures and things like that. But also Hen was keen on making sure that if we are going to plant trees, they need to thrive and not be a burden going forward. And that's an important, I think, a really important takeaway message, that those trees that we do get in the ground need to be there, because if we don't, we're not going to get the canopy cover that we're going to need going forward for all the reasons why we know that. But also Hen really homed in on getting the best quality technical advice, so that highway engineers can make decisions and they can source that good quality technical and tree planting advice when they need it. That's good. And then Chris followed on in that vein in getting talking about getting the technical importance of contract specifications right as well, identifying what's underground to start with, so underground ground penetrating radar, and also the importance of trial pits. And that's something that we certainly have, in terms of the government's grant schemes for tree planting, we've I think under the Urban Tree Challenge Fund, we've actually made sure that this 5th round you can actually apply for grant funding for trial pits, which is good. And then Chris also mentioned about making sure that you design to incorporate optimal tree pits, so that the trees, again, following on from what Hen was saying, the trees that you do plant are in optimal tree pits so that they can actually go on and be successful. And then Chris very helpfully gave examples of successful hard planting, some of the landscape schemes that he's been involved with in terms of using rain gardens as areas where you could get those that green infrastructure into the street, taking some road space as well if need be. That's really important, but also getting trees integrated into those circumstances. And then Esther, our last speaker of the day, was talking about national model design codes and local design codes. And as she said, they're coming down the track pretty quickly. I think we're going to see. I think we're going to see that if, as I understand it, and Esther, do correct me if I'm wrong, if the local authorities haven't produced their own design codes as of sort of now, they should be taking into consideration what the government have published in terms of their going forward in planning and things like that. But the new reform of the NPPF is going to bring that very much into focus going forward. Also, Esther highlighted the requirement for applying logical thinking in the development of local authorities' own design codes. So making sure that you had aims and a vision for place, code structures, and then that should lead you onto your own specific code for your own specific area. And then Esther very helpfully gave examples of existing codes in Medway and the North Circular in London. And that all these codes that local authorities are going to be producing going forward should cover trees in detail, because that's what they're going to need to do. And you should build, it's also one of the, I was really pleased to hear Esther say that you can build adjacent to pre-existing trees as long as you have take the right precautions. When I was a planning tree officer, we certainly took that view in the local authority I did. And for me, what that means is that if you keep retained trees on sites, either on streets or on the sites themselves, you hardwire that building. The building regulations mean that you hardwire that building for any other tree planting that might want to be done in the vicinity as well. So that's a really important point that Esther made. So that's the recap of everyone. Now, what I'd like to do now is if our speakers, they've all got their cameras switched on, so that's great. I think, Sue, are we going to take questions from the chat, or how are we going to do that? We'll have a few minutes of questions.
I have encouraged anybody, if you want to ask a question yourself, turn on your camera and put your hand up, because I think you come onto the front screen, because I've just been scrolling around the screen.
Sue, you happy for me to identify who's put their hand up?
Yes, if you can find them.
Because there's quite a few there's 11 pages of screens here. So
I know I've just scrolled through and there aren't any hands up yet. So
okay.
I've been picking up some questions in the chat. Perhaps Andy Merkel, are you around? Andy's got his hand up. Great. Andy.
I managed to find the button. Thank you.
Oh, perfect.
So I'm Andy Merkel from Leeds City Council. We've recently been looking at street trees, in particular, from my perspective as a network management engineer, in relation to Trees for Streets, the charity that's encouraging people to sponsor trees in streets, and that's caused all sorts of questions. But I did want to pick up, Robert mentioned that section 141 of the Highways Act, the no planting in the carriageway or within 15 feet, he described it as an urban myth, which I sort of not quite, in that my interpretation and the advice I've had from our legal team is that applies to anybody who isn't the highway authority or isn't planting under a license to cultivate. So i.e. it becomes an offence to plant one without asking. And that's where that clause applies, because 142 relates to a license to cultivate, and 96 puts our responsibilities on the highways authority when they're planting. But a quick one there, I've come up with all sorts of things from the utilities as I've been working on the street trees sort of side of things in Leeds, with people like BT, Openreach quoting section 96, which is that we're liable if we cause any damage to them by doing anything in the highway, which wasn't very helpful. And then we get Yorkshire Water telling us they need us at least 5 meters away from any sewer, which doesn't help street trees either. So it is a big can of worms, and it would be great to have some national guidance, as Hen said in her talk. I think she adequately described the frustrations that highways engineers who like trees have with these things. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy, for those insights. Has anybody else got any questions for our panel?
Clement has got their hand up.
Yes, hello. Hi, I'm Clement from London Borough. I've just got a question. So I'm working on a public realm scheme, and we're trying to introduce a number of trees in the area, but we've got lots of utility. So we're trying to, and as part of that, we put in the trees in rain garden tree pit or sand tree pit, which my understanding is that when you're doing a rain garden tree pit, you have to get everything sealed. So everything is sort of sealed. And our tree guys are of the view that when you seal everything, it doesn't give the tree opportunity to grow laterally and be able to use the natural soil. So they are not much in favor of these rain garden tree pits. I just wanted a bit of steer.
Chris, could you take that one? I think that's a technical one for you, I think. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to know the difference between these two tree pits and which of them give the tree better chance to survive, whether it's a sealed one or you don't seal it and let the trees find its own way through the roots to the soil. Yeah, just some guidance on that.
Yeah, well, I think from you kind of the consideration for how much soil the kind of trees need in terms of soil volume. I think if you're looking at quite small rain gardens that are a kind of sealed unit, then with a kind of impermeable liner to prevent any sort of passage of roots and water. Really, it's to capture the water within the rain garden. That would be the approach, so that you're kind of storing the runoff, so that there's no kind of potential pathways within to kind of utility ducts and things like that. Is kind of one of the main reasons why you'd kind of line a kind of rain garden. So really, just, I mean, if you've got quite a sizable area of planter, then the soil volumes are there to sort of cater for the tree. So I think it's probably just worth looking at what that soil volume is, and just how much space have the roots kind of got to grow into.
So in effect, you say that once you've achieved the soil volume, whether it's sealed or not, it doesn't make a difference.
I'd say so, yeah. I mean, we've got plenty of examples that have been sort of tried and tested where trees have been planted in rain gardens, and there's that kind of, you know, the kind of battle between those two approaches, really, that you've got, you know, you're trying to capture the surface water and store it and restrict the runoff into the an existing gully or a new connection or whatever that may be, versus the kind of trees which obviously need to have a kind of a minimum volume to grow into.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. That's helpful. I hope that's answered your questions, Clement. And we've got Mark Siret, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. If just to come back to Clement, and I think Ben's on the call as well. So what's crucial is that not sealing the roots in, gaseous exchange for the root health and tree survival is absolutely imperative. So yes, root barriers down the side, if that's what you mean, but sealing the top, absolutely no. So it really depends on what your design criteria are. If you're going down a tree pit, which is a crate system, then that's fine. If your main objective is to have water pollutant runoff dealt with, then what you don't want is a tree in porridge that's sealed in and no gaseous exchange. So that's then your Stockholm, particularly if it's in a roadway system that's going to have traffic over it. So air exchange is absolutely everything. That was it.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mark. And Mike Sankus, you got your hand up as well, which on my screen is very, very helpfully right next to Mark Siret. So
I know, I thought you were just mentioning me at first there. I'm not sure if you can see him. I'm running off of an iPad. It was really to pick up on that point about root barriers, really, and services. And my experience, I guess, I mean, some services can be disturbed by tree roots, but if you look at most street trees growing in most parts of the country, they're living in relative harmony. Occasionally they cause some damage. Depends on the age of the service, depends on how they've been connected. And I think I just have a bit of a problem in preventing trees and tree root systems from gaining access to native soils beyond that soil structure. And I don't know if there's anyone here from Green Blue Urban, but we've been talking about that quite a bit too. And there is no requirement to sort of contain that space. And it depends on what sort of space you're creating. So if you don't get enough space, then you're either not planting trees or you're not providing anywhere near the soil volume and anchorage that they need. So I would advise against sort of sealing off space beyond your crate system or beyond whatever structural soil you've used, and maybe find other ways of protecting surfaces if you really need to. Lots of them now have been re-sleeved and they're almost impervious to tree roots.
that's right. Thanks very much, Mark. And I'd echo that. If you've got modern services, tree roots shouldn't really be a problem. And my experience is that obviously older Victorian ones can be tricky. That's not well understood. But in the context of modern development now, there shouldn't be an issue. And I think you may have heard the expression that trees are the fifth utility, and that's certainly a sort of a mantra that TDAG is following at the moment, because they should be considered to be critical infrastructure on a par with those utilities, not somehow separate from them. So Sue, you got your hand up.
Yeah, so I've got lots of things all bubbling here now, but I really want, can we just look at this thing about soil volume? Because one of the things that always worries me is how we determine the soil volume that's needed. And if you've used the crate system, for example, and you think you've given masses of soil volume, what happens when your tree outgrows it? Do you have to, while you're installing that sort of system, actually allow your opportunity space? You know, where's it going to go once you've exhausted that soil volume? Or is it effectively in a pot? It's just a very big pot.
Has any of the panel like to take that?
Or any of the people on the call take it?
Or anyone else on the call? If not, I'll give here. Mike's got his hand up again. So there we go.
Well, it's exactly the same thing, really. I mean, I think that the idea should be not to limit tree roots to that space that you're creating, unless you absolutely have to for a service that's very vulnerable. And I mean, just to pick up on your point, Jim, about Victorian services, I mean, I think certainly Southern Gas Network are working their way around the country, re-sleeving and repurposing every pipe by putting a plastic welded pipe inside. Now, I don't think tree roots are going to be able to affect that unless a tree falls over ever. And so the notion of occasionally creating a problem with a service, but nearly always, if you limit the root system enough with substantial trees, creating a high risk of trees failing, either dying or falling over, I guess you've got to weigh up the pros and cons of each. And yeah, sorry, I'll leave that to you now. I know you see you've got you're dying to say something there too.
I can only see one page, so I'm going with Mark again. It seems like Mike are hogging the conversation, so we'll stick it at you. But Mark, see, just if you want to respond to Mike, do so.
Yeah, and just echoing what Mike was saying. So if you have a large species tree, and that's everyone's kind of objective, then minimum 30 cube pit. That's a big pit. Whereas if you're designing a 15 cube crate, a metre around the outside of that and root permeable through the crate at the lower levels and anchoring into the natural soil, that's still a 30 cube outside of your 15 cube design. So it's worth remembering that and knowing what space you've got, because when you dig your holes, that's when you find you've got your services that aren't where they're supposed to be. The trials that we did at Hove put a hybrid stock home outside of a crate just to see what would happen with that as well, and just see how they'll all go. So it's there to design and play with the space you've got, and that's usually your limiting criteria. What have you got and what can you make fit?
Yeah, I'd add to that often when I'm talking to colleagues about this, that we have all these targets now for tree planting and also tree canopy increases. There's the England-wide 16.5% tree canopy cover target. We've got the green infrastructure, the Natural England's green infrastructure, urban tree canopy cover standard now. But if we want trees to actually in our urban areas to deliver that canopy that we know is going to be important to deal with climate change and adaptation and resilience going forward, so that our cities are livable places, we need to accommodate the presence of significant amounts of roots underground in those areas. And I use the sort of rule of thumb that 20% of the tree's biomass is underground. If you think about that in the context of everything else that's under there, we really do need to get this right. So Sue, you got your hand up.
Yes, it's this top left corner that keeps putting its hand up. But can I just go back to Andy's point about S96, S141 and S142, Robert? This is one for you, really, because reading through the chat, one seemed to contradict the other. And then on top of that, we've got utilities trying to give us rules and regulations that may or may not exist in law. And everybody doesn't know how to deal with that because, of course, in principle, they want to keep the utilities happy, but at what cost?
Robert, was that addressed to you? I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. The Highway Authority is the Highway Authority, and it's got powers conferred upon it by the Highways Act. The utilities have powers. Well, I think they have to be licensed under the New Roads and Streetworks Act. In all these instances, read the legislation. So, I mean, that 15-foot thing, if you read the legislation, section 141 and 142, the offence by a landowner is only committed if he's or she has been served with a notice by the Highway Authority saying, get rid of this tree or shrub that lies within 15 feet of the made-up carriageway. There is a tendency to over-interpret legislation and think it's more draconian than it actually is. There is a tendency to think that organisations have powers that they don't, to think that guidance is regulation when it isn't. British standards, for example, they are guidance unless there's a piece of legislation somewhere that says that they have to be complied with. So, yeah, it's a British standard on street lighting. It's just an opinion of people who are involved in street lighting as to how to do street lighting. They haven't necessarily, in that spirit of the Wednesbury case, addressed the needs of other parts of society. They haven't necessarily taken those things into consideration. Sorry, this is a bit of a rambling answer, but do you see what I mean? The law is the law, and always go back to the law and read what it says. Don't say, accept what somebody says that law says. They may merely be saying that if we don't want it within 5 meters, that's what we'd like, but we have no powers, and it's really up to you.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I often tell people that in the context of utilities that the landowner can do they're entitled to plant a tree wherever they like on their land, even if it's directly above the service. And I've done that myself. I've said that on previous TDAG calls. The issue is, as is just mentioned by Mike, if there's an issue further down the road, then you might need to lose the tree. But a utility company, unless you've signed a way leave agreeing to those sorts of limitations as a landowner, then they can't insist on that. So, but I've got, if there are no other questions, and I can't see any hands up, I've got a quick question for Esther. If she's turned her camera off. Esther, are you still with us? No.
I'm here. Sorry, I was
great.
just coughing.
Okay.
So
I'm sorry to ask you this because I know you've got a sore
Yeah,
throat.
go on. I was just coughing, so I turned myself off.
Okay. Well, thank you for staying with us for so long. My question to you is about you mentioned in your thing about making sure that design codes cover trees in detail. One of the things that we noticed about the National Model Design Code, they had great pictures of trees pretty much on every illustration, but nothing to do with the tree below ground level. Are design codes, is it within their remit to show underground design at all?
Design codes are designed to work within the planning system. So anything that needs planning permission is potentially, the design code will be a material consideration when a planning application is looked at, including changes to existing streets. Obviously, a lot of what happens in existing streets doesn't need planning permission. They will only apply where you don't have planning permission if you've managed wonderfully to get the highway authority to adopt them as their standard, which obviously would be really, really helpful. And if that's possible. And the advice is absolutely to work with the highway authority right from word go. So engineering works under the ground do require planning permission. So the bit under the ground will do. The National Model Design Code drawings it is meant to be a methodology, and yes, it's a fallback for those who don't have their own local codes, but it certainly is a generic kind of primer of some issues, and that's why it itself says focus on the things that matter to you, based on your evidence of your engagement and also your understanding of what the priorities, your policy priorities, objectives are, and also what the character and problems are in your area. So that is certainly what goes on under the ground can be coded to be applied through the planning system. Obviously, this planning system is discretionary, so you can still get planning permission for things that don't meet it, or you could still get a refusal for planning application for things that do meet it if it's all about housing numbers. Basically, if it's always weighted, all the policy requirements are weighted. So the law makes it clear that the code should be policy, so it gives it much more weight than guidance. So I don't know if that's answering your question.
It has. That's been really helpful.
Yes, but that's how it works in the planning system.
Great, thank you. That is really helpful. When I was a planning tree officer, I used to use conditions to if you planted a particular type of tree as part of the landscape scheme, we used conditions to ensure that the foundations of the property permitted that tree to grow to its full extent.
And then you have to get the details to come forward. What hasn't been mentioned today is a biodiversity net gain. So that came in in the planning system. It came in as a requirement for major schemes in February and for small schemes in April 1st. It's really, I'm sure everyone on the call knows better than I do how difficult it is proving to apply in the planning system, particularly for small schemes where none of the architects, planning consultants, developers, anybody, planning officers have a clue what it's required if it's going to be on site. And obviously trees are only one element of the type of biodiversity that can be provided. But certainly those questions about where you draw your red line. So there was a comment earlier about whether you've got public streets or private owned streets or private courtyard parts of back of pavement areas which are often actually privately owned, but they look like they're part of the street. So if the red line goes around that, you can start to provide your biodiversity net gain within that area. So I think it's, again, it's not an issue that I've looked at it myself in detail, but there's potential. It's very, very new. And even if you get planning permission, if you don't fulfil the condition requiring biodiversity net gain, you can't build. It's a non-discretionary requirement.
Well, I actually helped develop that system for
Oh,
the
you know better than
individual trees bit. So I put my hand up there, but I think that myself and my colleague Amanda Newson, who's the Forestry Commission's Biodiversity Net Gain Advisor, we've been giving webinar presentations to various parties, and you're right, it looks really complicated as a system, I think, but once you get into it and understand it, it's just about biodiversity, and it sits alongside all the other protections and legislation for trees. It doesn't supersede or have primacy over them. But for me, it's about retaining, if you've got good quality trees on the site that are providing biodiversity, good quality biodiversity, they should be retained, and the development site should accommodate those. However, if they, and it doesn't stop trees being felled, but if they are removed from the site, there are sort of like systems in place or mechanism in place so that that biodiversity is created elsewhere, either just off the site, and you know there are, in the way that old Section 106 agreements used to get tree planting in the locality, that sort of thing. The mechanisms now for that off-site provision to be done either locally or, you know, in extremis, using credits elsewhere in the country, that sort of thing. So,
but I think there's a lot of detail to be worked out in practice, because filling out the forms for small sites and working out how much, if you can get a bit on site and a bit off site, the practicalities of doing it all is still up in the air, and we don't really know what the opportunity is for the small sites particularly.
Yeah,
There's
that's one of the.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
I was just saying there's a question in the chat about when will the manual for streets be published. Probably after the next general election. So it was written. I was on the steering group for it with IHBC. That's the
DIHT.
DIHT. The other IHBC is the heritage group, and it was being written. It's been edited. It's been looked at in detail, and it's not been published. I understand, I might be wrong, for political reasons, because in case it's seen as anti-car. So it's there. So I don't think we'll see it until after the next general.
Yes, my understanding is it's been paused. Yes, yeah. So thanks very much for that, Esther. That's really helpful.
I'm going to go now, actually, if you don't mind, because I'm not feeling very well. But
okay.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's been really interesting.
Thanks so much, Esther. And also we'll get back to you when we finally get all these documents, these drawings in place for you to review.
Okay, thank you very much, Esther. Right. So have we got any more questions for our panel members?
Well, I'd like to pick up on a couple of questions that I saw going through the chat earlier on about the need to employ a landscape architect and tree officers. There was a few comments in the chat about employing landscape architects and talking to your tree officers. And I think this comes back to something I said at the beginning of my chat about the difference between the urban authorities and the predominantly rural authorities. I mean, Gloucestershire is a big authority, and I think we do now have a tree officer. Landscape architects? No, absolutely not. And with the planning system, so we're dealing with new adoptions that will become highways. The landscape architects that are designing these or working with the street designers are employed by the applicant and the developer. So their remit is whatever they're being employed to deliver. They're not working for us, they're not working for the Highways Authority. And that's a big problem that we find. Again, we just don't have that. That's why we need this guidance that is working for everybody, that's good guidance, that's based on expert advice. So we're not relying on different landscape architects that are employed by different people with different remits. And tree officer, I'd love to ask my tree officer. I would desperately love to ask my tree officer. I think we might find, I mean, I don't know who we've got on the call, but it might be interesting to do a quick straw poll of tree officers and how many of them actually do work for shire authorities and how many of them are working for the more urban authorities.
Can we do that with a show of hands, and I'll count them up? If you're a tree officer working for shire authority, put your hand up. I'm just scanning through the pages.
Andy Lederer, Michael Sankus.
Oh, can you see them, Sue? Yeah.
Dina. Three hands up.
Okay.
When I work for a unitary authority, I'm not quite sure what you mean by a shire authority, but I presume you mean a county or a unitary.
Well, something that's predominantly rural rather than predominantly urban. So I'm in my are you Leeds, did you say?
No, I'm Medway in Kent, which is definitely not predominantly rural, so I'll put my hand down.
Okay.
But I am a tree officer and I do work in a planning service.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got Andy Lederer and Tom Russell's now got his hand up. So I'm going to go on, and I don't know which order they came in, so I'm just going to go who's top left on my screen. So Andy, or have you just taken your hand down?
I think he was just putting his hand up to say he was a tree officer.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Okay. So
why I put my hand up, sorry. It was just for a shire authority as a county council.
But
okay.
Andy, while we've got you here, one of the questions that keeps coming up is how do we deal with trees and footway issues? It's one that Hen, who's on our steering group, constantly raises, and we sort of keep trying to find solutions to. But you've just done that street in Oxford, New Street, where you found a solution.
Yeah, it was very expensive. I think as long as you've got it, like with anything, there's always a solution to any problem. It just depends on how much investment you're willing to give and how, therefore, what is value for money. And I think it's quite useful. We've used CAVAP to justify whether or not so capital asset valuation of amenity trees, for those that don't or haven't heard of CAVAP before, to help justify value for money expenditure to retain trees in problem settings and whether or not it's reasonable or valid to look to preserve the tree by spending more money to recreate the infrastructure around the tree so you get the surface that you require. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's useful. I haven't asked you how much it actually costs, but I know everybody's grateful it's happened. But because Christine King also raised a really interesting point, Jim, that trees are too often being treated as disposable assets, at the end of 20 years, take them
absolutely
away.
right. They need to be considered, as I said earlier, as critical infrastructure and the fifth utility, because they're going forward in the future when we start having 40-degree heat in southeast England and 35 across the rest of the country. We're going to need them in our urban cities. So, Paul Robertson, you got your hand up. Have you got a question?
Yeah, hi there. I was just coming back. I'm afraid I'm not an arboriculturist. I'm a landscape architect by trade, and I work for Wiltshire Council. We're a predominantly rural authority, unitary authority, and there's three of us in Wiltshire. I've also got there are two ARB officers in the highways team and two in the planning team. So I guess we're just either exceedingly lucky or we have a more treed priority in Wiltshire, maybe. I don't know.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul.
Yeah,
Mike?
I think just picking up on that, Paul, I think this is just my opinion, but with a lot of the shire authorities, there may be an over-dependence on, we've got lots of green space, we've got lots of countryside, we don't need to worry too much about the trees. Whereas perhaps the urban authorities, your trees are in urban environments and you do have to worry them. So maybe there's more ability for those authorities to put the funding into urban trees because that's where your greening is. I mean, as I said, that is just my opinion, but it'd be interesting to see what people think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Hen. I think that's very true. And that's one of the reasons when CAVAT, the system that Andy Lederer mentioned, when CAVAT was originally mooted, it had three bandings, and the trees in inner city areas were more highly valued than those on the outskirts of cities, as it were, just for that very reason that you mentioned. So Mike Sankus, you've got your hand up still. So.
Oh yeah, sorry. All I was going to say, and on your point about the importance of trees in terms of them being part of the infrastructure, it was just really picking up on the point about street lighting and that tree that someone showed with a lamppost woven into it. I mean, my experience is sometimes the trees were there first and someone puts the lamppost in amongst the trees, which is always slightly annoying. But I guess the two need to be designed together. My experience is there's more flexibility in designing a street lighting system around trees than vice versa. And in the same way as a lighting scheme has got to take account of things like junctions and houses, I guess they just need to take account of trees too, or space for trees. And if trees are being planted as part of the scheme, expecting them to grow. And so it's really just considering everything in the round rather than, as you say, trees becoming almost a disposable asset.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Mark. We haven't mentioned it yet, although Esther, while she was here, mentioned local plans, and we haven't actually mentioned tree and woodland strategies, but certainly if the local authorities have, they should have a tree strategy, or certainly a tree and woodland strategy if they have woodlands under their control. And that should be linked to their local plan. And going forward, they're going to be national management design plans, I think they're called, as part of the NPPF reform. So going forward, those sorts of that sort of cooperative working between highway engineers, local authority tree officers, and other departments, particularly those departments that hold the purse strings, as Andy has mentioned, is going to be increasingly important to get what we want in place, as it were, going forward.
So Jim, can I just ask, because David Miller's raised a good point, as a borough council tree officer, I find it very difficult to cut through attitudes that trees should take less priority than streets, buildings and services. So if we really want trees to be a fifth utility, how are we going to collectively kind of push that concept along so that they are balanced, you know, these balanced decisions, they are on a par with all the other elements?
My short answer to that would be we have to include in the valuation of trees, or how we determine what value they provide society. We've got to integrate the health and well-being value, monetize that, because that's going to be the one that I think tips the balance for me. At the moment, we've got ecosystem services, but some of the values that we get from that are not great. For instance, air quality. It's there, but it's not. You know, it's not a game changer. I think the game changer in terms of seeing them as the fifth utility is going to be using them, getting that monetized benefit in terms of people's health and well-being. And they're doing it more and more in the States. I've said this before, that there's an insurance company in Northwest America that gives lower premiums to people who live in areas with higher tree canopy cover, because they recognise the value that brings. But Robert and Hen and Chris, have you got any comments on that?
On trees and well-being?
How we get trees to be considered critical infrastructure going forward?
I don't know. I think as a general point, we need to be conscious of the best is the enemy of the good. Streets are always a compromise. And it's back to that Wensbury unreasonableness criterion, making balanced decisions. It's better to have okay than nothing. So that's what I would commend. I don't think there's a cosmic optimum out there, and sometimes a belief that there is a perfect way of doing things. If only we could find it, must be somewhere out there. It actually stops people from doing things, be it planting trees or making changes to the geometry of a road. I think just get on with it and compromise. Okay,
that's really good advice. Thank you, Robert. Chris, you were about to say something.
I'd back that up actually, because it's really just the examples of how it can be done, and you know how a space can be changed because of the introduction of trees. People want to use that space. You know, it's valuable to local communities. You know, if there was two residential developments and one was very sort of traditional, hard tarmac roads, 2 meter footways, and another one with lots of tree planting, then which would have the higher house value? You know, it's creating the places that people want to be in and enjoy.
Where would you want your family to grow up? That's
exactly
the question people ask themselves, isn't it?
That's it. And if there's a value that you could put to that, then that's, you know, like you said, is something to actually assess it and quantify it by.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chris. So Sue, you got your hand up.
Oh, have I? I'm just waving my hand around so it goes up. I was going to say, somebody's asked us the $1 million question. When do we think all these drawings and this guidance will be published?
Well, that is the $1 million question. Yes, I gave some feedback to my colleagues in DEFRA about that today. So I've said it's on the horizon, but we're still working on it. So
it's actually proved to be more complicated than we thought. But
yeah, I mean, as soon as possible. It's something that that's been my raison d'etre for a number of years. We desperately need it, and until we get it, I totally agree with Robert that it is a compromise. Everything that we do on the street is a compromise. We get these lovely design codes and these lovely best practice, and it never ever works out. We are always compromising, but we want to compromise as little as possible and deliver as best as possible, and that's what we really need this guidance to do. So
I think that we've got 3 minutes left. I think that's a really good point on which to finish the conversation if no one's got any more burning questions. So thanks for that, Hen. I would echo that. I think cooperative working involves compromise, doesn't it? And that's something that we all have to, as professions, we have to. I think we tend not to be so great at that in this country. I think other countries do it better than us, so particularly on the continent. So what I'd like to do is if everybody could show their appreciation for our speakers by in the time-honoured digital fashion, which is I think we can clap hands on this one. Can we do that?
It depends how technologically savvy you are, Jim. I don't know
I'm
if I
not
can
that
clap
great, I'm
hands.
afraid. Can you help out, Emma? What do they do?
I think it's under reactions. There we go.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to give a thumbs up. There we go. So thank you very much to Robert, Hen, and Chris, and obviously Esther, who's had to leave. Thank you again to Emma and to Sue for sort of like keeping me in line and chipping in with questions from the chat. But I think that's been a really informative session. And to do keep track of what TDAG's doing in terms of working on this thing. We are hopeful that that guidance will be out as soon as possible, and we're working as fast as we can on it. But as Sue mentioned, it's thrown up a lot of, as we found out from the conversation today, thrown up a lot of questions that need to be resolved before we can put actually get it out published. One of the delays being we were actually waiting for Manual for Streets to be published so that we could see what it said before we published ours. But now that looks like that's not going to happen anytime soon, we're going to progress with this, and hopefully we can influence that when it does come out, if and when, sort of thing. So we're coming up to time. Sue, thank you. Emma, thank you. I think that's it. I think we can all say goodbye to each other. So if you'd like to all switch your cameras on and give us a wave. So
I'll just thank you, Jim. I'll also say that I'll put into the chat when the next TDAG seminar is, that everything will be on the TDAG website under past events, the recording, the chat with all the references and so on. If you're not already on the TDAG contacts list and you want to be, just get in touch. And just thank you, everybody, and thank you all for attending in West Wales, a sunny afternoon. So I shall go and enjoy the last bits of my cup of tea. Thank you all.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.